Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and thank you for participating in today's 1036th Justice Clearinghouse webinar, Working at the Speed of Crime, Evidence Screening in Support of NIBIN. Any effective crime gun intelligence program relies on the expeditious processing of firearms-related evidence to achieve the goal of intelligence-led, firearms-based investigations. And during our webinar today, Jessica Alfreds will discuss the challenges that Denver police faced in making a department-wide cultural change in evidence handling and the partnerships required to implement new evidence screening and processing strategy in support of their CGIC goals. Jessica Alfreds is a criminal intelligence analyst with the Phoenix Police Department's Violent Crimes Bureau in their Crime Gun Intelligence Unit. She has worked for the Phoenix Police Department for 16 years and has been working with the Crime Gun Intelligence Unit since 2010. In partnership with Maricopa County Attorney's Office and the Phoenix Police Laboratory Services Bureau, she recently authored and implemented a new firearms-related evidence processing policy and successfully enabled Phoenix Police Department to become compliant with ATF's MROS and resulting in the expedited processing of firearms-related evidence. Now, today's presentation is done in partnership with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology is a leader in forensic analysis, providing innovative and effective solutions like its unique technology, the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, known as IBIS. IBIS is designed to find the needle in the haystack by discovering matches between pairs of spent bullets and cartridge cases at speeds well beyond human capacity. Forensic technology helps experts obtain timely information so they can make society a safer place. And the last few things I'd like to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It will be available to members on the Justice Clearinghouse website and on the Ultra website. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions you have through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll respond to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. And finally, after today's presentation, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback is shared with our presenters and helps shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to our instructor for today. Jessica, it's all yours.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everybody. Like Aaron said, I'm Jessica Alfreds with Phoenix Police Department. And I was going to share with you guys today a little bit about how we are handling our Crime Gun Intelligence Unit and evidence processing here in Phoenix. And just to kind of start off, to give you guys an idea of the size of Phoenix so you can compare to your own agencies. Right now, Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the United States, sitting at about just over 1.6 million people. And we just dropped down to a little over 2,646 sworn personnel here for Phoenix Police Department. So that's, I'm sure everybody is seeing, our dwindling number of police officers. Phoenix is facing that same sort of problem. So we should have quite a few more than that. But 2,646 is what we were at as of this morning. As far as our volume of evidence processing, firearms-related evidence, our NIBIN program here is averaging about 550 eligible items a month just for the city of Phoenix. We impound close to or over 5,200 guns a year. And in all of our evidence casings are impounded in bags, and it equates to about 180 bags of evidence per month that we are impounding here in Phoenix. To give you guys some insight here in Phoenix as to how we are set up, we are slightly unique to most agencies in that our NIBIN program is entirely outside of our crime lab. We are actually embedded within our Violent Crimes Bureau as an investigative detail. We are comprised of both civilian and sworn personnel who are trained, both sides are trained in our NIBIN processing. And then our sworn detectives also handle the investigative portion, which I'll explain as part of this presentation here in just a bit. But again, as far as volume of evidence that we are processing for NIBIN and into NIBIN, we're averaging about 550 items a month into our NIBIN system. Our database, I think, is sitting at just over 90,000 items, 90,000 samples in our system. We implemented NIBIN here in Phoenix back in 2002. but we were doing it very differently when we first started the NIBIN process. So over several years, we have modified it and changed it to the process that you're going to see today. Our crime gun intelligence unit, which is both our NIBIN component and our investigative component, we handle the entire NIBIN process from beginning to end. We still have our crime scene techs who will go out to crime scenes to do that initial scene investigation with our detectives, but then our crime gun intelligence unit personnel will go out to that scene to receive custody of evidence in our homicides and some of our more violent crimes in order to bring it directly back to the office for processing. We swab guns, we swab casings, we handle all of the test firing, we do the entries into NIBIN. We also are correlation certified, although we are on the Correlation Center, so we have them as a partner. We handle our lead dissemination in partnership with ATF, and then we also do the investigations and the arrests in our different investigations. So we're kind of a one-stop shop for everything NIBIN related. The only part that really gets sent off is the confirmation of our findings going to our crime lab so that those findings can be confirmed by our forensic examiners. So how did we get here? As I mentioned, we've had a NIBIN program since about 2002, but back then, even as early as 2014, we were processing a very small percentage of our evidence. I want to say pre-CGIC grant, we were averaging about 12% of our evidence actually making it into NIBIN. And in most cases, that evidence was getting processed after a case was adjudicated. And we were doing it just to make sure that the guns weren't used in anything else before they got sold or destroyed. So we were utilizing NIBIN completely backwards from how we're doing it now. Our agency was one of the first 5 agencies to receive the DOJ CGIC grant back in 2016. And receiving that grant was integral in us being able to make the changes in our processes. When we sat down to identify how we were going to set up our NIBIN program, we recognized the intelligence aspect of it and the impact that that intelligence could have on our violent firearms investigations. And we really wanted to integrate it in a way to be able to leverage NIBIN as more than just a forensic tool. So when we describe our NIBIN program, it's important to understand that the processes we put in place were done entirely in support of our investigations. And we believe that it should be embedded within the investigations, which is why we have it set up the way that we do. In looking at the research that was done when we were coming up with our goals and objectives for creating our CGIC, one of the big things that stuck out to us was the statistic that we've heard over and over again, that the top 2% of, I'm sorry, I take it back, 2% of your population is responsible for over 80% of your violent firearms related crime. And so when you look at a prevention strategy for gun crime, we felt it was incredibly important to really focus on identifying that 2% of the population that was causing the most violence. And that if we could really focus our efforts on identifying that top 2%, we would be in a better place to be able to drive down our violent crime rates. And so how do you identify who your 2% are? How do you identify those individuals that are out there repeatedly pulling the trigger over and over and over again? Well, NIBIN. NIBIN provided us with the ability to identify that. By making those ballistic links between multiple incidents, we now can see a specific firearm that has gone active in a specific area during a specific period of time that now we can focus our efforts on and be able to prevent that trigger puller from continuing to escalate in violence and from continuing to go out and reoffend and pull the trigger at more scenes. And so for us, using NIBIN in order to identify that top 2% was a no-brainer for us. So one of the things we looked at was the structure of our investigations. And one thing that our detectives were telling us was they felt like they were rearresting the same people over and over again. They'd go out, arrest a guy with a gun, he would go to initial appearance at court, get released on bond, and be back out a week later reoffending with a new gun. So how could we bring that to a stop? So for us, partnerships and bringing in all of the stakeholders on this became incredibly important. Typically, when you have an occurrence of crime, that case or that incident gets assigned to a detective, and that detective then goes and investigates that incident and builds their probable cause, makes an arrest, goes to initial appearance, maybe they take a plea, maybe they go to trial, and then it goes through the sentencing. And the resources from beginning to end, from the time the crime occurs to the time of sentencing and all the people involved, is tremendous. It's a very complex process that involves a lot of different people, and we were doing it over and over and over again for these same individuals. So we wanted to incorporate a way for us to utilize NIBIN to be able to group incidents together prior to an arrest, prior to that person being taken into custody, so that at the time that they were taken into custody, we could group our charges from all the preliminarily linked incidents that we linked through NIBIN, that we could group those charges together, submit them together on multiple incidents at once instead of just one, and then have our attorney show up at initial appearance and be able to show escalation in violence, repeat use of a firearm, and likelihood to reoffend, so that we could ask for no bond and get those individuals held. That was our ultimate goal. If we could have our NIBIN links identified in as close to real time as possible, and we had that information at the time of arrest was made, we could present that at court and ask for no bond. The only way for us to accomplish that was if our NIBIN processes were done comprehensively and is in as real time as possible. Obviously, we had to meet the 2 business day goals that ATF had put into place, as far as a NIBIN site needing to have all of their firearms evidence processed in a NIBIN within 2 business days. But we really kind of wanted it to be even faster than that, so that we could use this as a tool in that initial arrest and in that initial appearance in order to get these individuals help. We also recognized that in order to do that, we were going to drastically change the way that we were processing our firearms evidence. We were going to change how we were looking at and determining want versus need in DNA and prints on firearms and on casings. We were going to potentially impact the way our prosecutors were going to be moving forward with their cases. We were going to be impacting our crime lab and how they're processing evidence, and the way what has already been done on the evidence at the time that the evidence gets to them, since it was going to be coming to us first. And so us bringing those different groups to the table was going to be the key to our success. Additionally, here in Phoenix, our detectives, when a detective takes the case, they typically are the ones that have a say in what forensic processes are done on their evidence. And in order for us to meet our 2 business day goal, or our real-time results goal, we in essence were going to be taking that decision away from them, because all firearms and all casings were going to have to be coming directly to NIBIN, and that processing was going to have to be automatic. So we brought our detectives and our investigators into the conversation so that they could be educated as to what we were trying to do, how we wanted to do it, and how it was going to impact their cases moving forward. Something that also makes Arizona slightly interesting is that a majority of our weapons cases are tried at the state level. It is incredibly rare for one of our cases to be tried at the federal level. Our laws here just work in a way that we get bigger bang for the buck at the state level. And so when we talk about NIBIN and the ability to have NIBIN associations that are multi-agency or multi-jurisdictional, in which we have 3 or 4 instances of crime here in Phoenix, and then we link to a case in Glendale, and we link to a case in Tempe, or we link to a case in Avondale. All of those cases are going to get charged at the state level. And so we brought in other agencies also in order to have these conversations, so that when we did that grouping based off of the preliminary NIBIN results, we were grouping in multi-agency charges together. Again, biggest bang for the buck. We recognized that these individuals were repeat offenders and likely to reoffend, And the more that we could group together and present an initial appearance, the better. And so having those other agencies as part of it was incredibly important. So I talked a lot about collaboration. How do we meet that 2 business day goal? We brought in our assistant lab director, and we brought in the heads of our different bureaus within Maricopa County Attorney's Office, and we sat them all down at the table together. We brought all of our statistics, and our lab guys sat down in front of the attorneys and said, the volume of lab requests that we have coming into our crime lab is so significant that in your basic weapons cases, we are not even going to have the capacity to do prints and DNA on your evidence until that case is scheduled for trial. Because we had such a high volume of priority homicides, violent crimes that were going to trial, that evidence was taking precedence over the weapons cases. And so our lab was very honest in admitting that prints and DNA off of guns was not going to lead you to your suspect. Now, could it potentially prove possession later on? Only if you're scheduled for trial, which means you already have the person in custody, you've already made the arrest. And so was it worth holding up the NIBIN process while we waited for prints and DNA to be done? It was not. And our attorneys agreed with us that the potential information that we could receive by linking these crime scenes together through NIBIN that could then be turned into intelligence was a lot more valuable to us than us waiting for that case to go to trial before we get that evidence to link it to other items. They also agreed that if we waited for that process to occur, then our overall goal of being able to get these people held at the beginning wasn't going to be possible. Another big conversation we had with our attorneys was want versus need. When we went to our detectives and asked them what one of the biggest hurdles they were facing in their cases was in being able to move forward, one of the things they said was that the attorneys were always asking for prints and DNA on everything. Like it was an automatic, we need the lab report on prints and DNA on the firearms or prints and DNA on the casings. And that it was an automatic request coming for attorneys for prints and DNA on everything. So we brought in a bunch of our attorneys and we brought in a bunch of their bosses and we had that conversation on want versus need. We're in the days of body cams, and here in Phoenix, all of our officers have body cameras now. So we had that discussion on if you have 3 officers at a scene with body cameras and the body cams all show them pulling the firearm out of their suspect's waistband, and it's documented that the gun was pulled out of their waistband, and you have their testimony that the gun was pulled out of their waistband and it's all on camera, do you really need prints and DNA to prove possession in that case? Do we really need to hold up the rest of the processing of that firearm for prints and DNA when you have all this other proof or evidence to show that the gun was in the person's possession? And our attorneys agreed, no, we don't. We wanted to come up with a blanket statement of whether or not a gun needed to be processed for prints and DNA or whether it did not. And what we came up with was possession. And I'll go into it a little bit more specifically here in a few slides. But ultimately it came down to if the gun was recovered off of a person in their waistband, in their shirt, in a holster on their hip, on their hand, if they handed them the gun or something like, and it's documented that that's where the gun was recovered from, then we were able to proceed with our test firing process using some clean techniques I'll show you guys. If the gun was found anyplace else, including in a backpack on their back, we were always going to swab that firearm prior to test firing it for NIBIN. And then we proceeded to go into the actual details of how we were going to swab it in collaboration with our attorneys so that they were educated on exactly how we were going to do it and so that they could agree that those processes were going to work We also had our lab involved in that conversation so that they could discuss what further processing could be done and whether or not our process was going to impact their process. If so, how, and how we were going to mitigate any sort of mistakes or issues or contamination, those sorts of things. So that was a true collaboration between us, our crime lab, and our attorneys to get all three groups to be on board and agree to the written policy of how we were going to address prints and DNA on firearms. And I tell you what, having that partnership with our attorneys and having them part of that conversation was tremendous. We ended up going and holding forensic academy classes with our attorneys, both prosecutors and defense, in order to educate them on the whole process, so that we didn't have unnecessary back and forth of trying to explain it. We set up trainings for everybody so that they could be familiar with the changes in our process. Okay, so this was one of the changes that we had made, and we'd actually made this a little bit prior to that, but in order to address how we are processing our evidence cases, we have here in Phoenix implemented using these little snap top vials for the impounding of our casings. And there was a lot of training involved in this because it changed how patrol was handling evidence. It changed how our crime scene folks that were going out and processing scenes were handling evidence. It changed how it was being packaged. It changed the number of bags of items that we were getting. So it affected a lot of different groups when we made this change, but we were able to articulate the need for it and get all those groups on board with it. So all of our evidence casings now get impounded in these little snap top vials. The ones you see in the picture here, they don't have numbers on the lids, but typically, if we go out and process the scene, you may have 30 evidence casings out at that scene. Our crime scene folks or patrol or whoever's processing that scene they will actually number the lids on each of the casings, and then the number on the lid matches the placard that they use during their photos, so that when we get a bag of casings and they're numbered 1 through 30, if we needed to, we could go back and look at the photos and we know exactly which casing came from each location in those photos, from each location in the scene. If we determine there are 2 different guns at the scene, they can see that these 5 casings were located here. Those were from one gun. These casings over here were from a different gun. We know exactly which casings were in each location. But what the biggest thing that this allowed us to do is when we bring them in here for NIBIN processing, and we are pre-screening all of those casings to identify, how many guns we have and which one is the best sample for entry into NIBIN, we don't have to touch the casing. All we have to do is snap the lid off of that vial, and now we can, while holding the vial, look at it under the microscope, and we can do our pre-screening of our casings without ever actually handling any of them. Then, whichever one is selected for entry into NIBIN, that one casing, we will swab it before we enter it in the system, just to preserve any potential DNA that may be on it prior to us handling it and doing the entry on it. All the other casings that we aren't entering are all still available for prints and DNA at the crime lab. They're all still available. If it's the only casing at the scene, we'll always swab it prior to entry. But if there's multiple casings, we will go through, and whichever one is selected for NIBIN, if it is in a violent offense, which we call it one of our tier 1 offenses, a homicide, officer involved shooting, anything that's high profile, we will always swab the one casing selected for entry prior to entering it into the system. Anything that is a patrol impound, if it's a case that necessitates a detective response, in those instances, we have our crime scene units that go out and process the scenes. But if it doesn't necessitate a detective response, then our patrol officers are the ones processing the scene and impounding the evidence at the scene. And so anything that is a patrol impound, meaning it didn't rise to the level of needing a detective response, in those instances, if we have multiple casings, let's say it's just a simple shots fired call out at a scene, and there's just casings in the street, there's no victims, there's no suspects, there's nothing like that, and the patrol's just impounding those casings, When we do our pre-screening, the one that we select for entry in the system just simply gets entered into the system. We're not swabbing those because there are other casings that we have available for prints and DNA if it ends up hitting to something of a larger scale. But by switching to these little snap top vials, it has allowed us to be able to pre-screen everything while still preserving that ability for all the additional prints and DNA to be done at the lab if it's determined that it's needed at a later time. That allows us to expedite that process. We do still allow our homicide detectives, they're really the only ones. If for some reason there is a belief that the casings maybe came out of somebody's pocket and they need prints on them, in very rare instances, they can go directly to the crime lab for processing for prints and DNA at the crime lab. But because that is such a rare event, the process at the crime lab automatically expedites those in those situations, meaning that process gets done within a day or two, and then those casings get directed directly to us after that, and there isn't much of a delay there. Versus when everything was going to the lab, it may be 3, 4, or 5 months before we get those items back from the lab. Now we reduce that so that it's such a rare thing that we'll get it in a day or two because they have the ability to process that stuff a lot faster. So this is kind of how we handled the firearms, and I'll show you guys some pictures here in just a bit. I talked about tier 1. We basically split it into tier 1 guns and tier 2 guns. We try really hard for our tier 1 guns to get done the same day, and our tier 2 guns typically come to us the following day. This is that detective response would be tier 1, and tier 2 would be anything that comes from patrol. Anything that is the detective response, we have detectives going out to the scene, and we have our crime scene folks going out to the scene. So we wanted to be able to receive our firearms-related evidence directly from those scenes so that we can bring it back, have it processed, and have any sort of NIBIN leads identified, and that information back to our investigators before they've cleared the scene. In a lot of cases, we can do this whole process in about an hour. So our homicide detectives could still be out working their scene, and we're calling them with the results saying the casings we recovering from your crime scene are hitting to these other 2 ag assaults or shots fired calls that have happened in the last 2 weeks. That was our goal, so that they have that information in real time as they're out there working the scenes. We've had instances where we've been able to call them and say the casings that you're seeing are hitting to a shots fired call in an apartment complex 2 blocks away, and the security guard thinks maybe he knows who the individual was. And they literally sent one detective from the homicide scene to the apartment complex, and sure enough, the security guard was able to identify who they believed the suspect was in their shots fired call at the apartment complex. And they went to go knock on the guy's door, and the guy bailed out the window, and they caught him with the murder weapon on him while they were still processing the homicide scene based off of the NIBIN lead. So we either send one of our crime gun intelligence personnel out to that scene to receive those items in chain of custody from the scene, or somebody from the scene will come and drop it off of here at our office, and we document that chain of custody here in the office. But either way, typically those tier 1 items come directly to us. We have recently implemented a drop box for casings here at our site. We made our site an impound location for our officers so that when they impound items, instead of impounding them at the warehouse or impounding them at the lab, they can bring them here and impound them here with us. And then now we have immediate access to them. Typically, those are those situations where it maybe was a tier 2 incident, or so it was patrol response, but this particular patrol officer knows more information about the case and thinks that maybe this individual is involved in other things and wants the process sped up a little bit. So they'll come and drop those casings up here in our drop box after hours. We're not a 24-hour operation. So it's just an after hours drop box for stuff that is important, but not necessarily real time tier 1 important. When it comes to the guns, we implement that need to have versus want to have here. On our tier 1s, yes, we still give them that option for that gun to go for prints at the lab before it comes to us. if it is needed. I can tell you it is very rare for them to send it to the lab first. Because we've gotten so many wins with our homicide unit on being able to provide them real-time information, they can't wait to get it to us. They will send somebody from the scene to bring it to us, and a lot of times the homicide guys will wait right here while we're doing the entries for the answers. It allows us to have that relationship with them. They know all of us by name, we know all of them by name. Half of our CGIC detectives are former homicide detectives, and so that partnership is there, and they want that information quick. So it is rare for them to go to the lab for prints prior to coming to us, because of how we are swabbing guns. And I'll show you guys here in a second exactly how we're swabbing the guns to allow us to do it this way. But ultimately, when we do our swabs on our guns, we are only swabbing the textured areas of the firearm that we have to touch in order to make the gun function. So we're leaving all of the smooth surfaces, we're leaving magazines, ammunition, holsters, any other accessories, the live ammunition that was ejected out of the gun. All of those other items are available for prints and DNA. We are only swabbing the areas we have to touch in order to make it shoot. Included in that is we always will swab the front muzzle, the end of the barrel, because our lab had done some research and identified that the best place for them to get DNA, clean DNA off of the firearm, besides the magazine, was off of the front muzzle, the end of it, the front sight, more specifically. They got great DNA samples off of the front sight because these guys are always shoving these guns down their waistbands, and that front sight picks up all kinds of good DNA. So we include swabbing that front sight area in our swabbing so that we can preserve that before we go shooting the firearm or before we're touching the end of that gun to anything in our shoot process. So again, the specifics of how we're swabbing our firearms was done in an agreement with our attorneys and our crime lab so that everybody was in agreement as to how we're doing it. We have not interfered with our ability for that firearm to go for additional DNA and prints on the smooth surfaces to be done by the crime lab at a later point in time. For our tier 2 guns that come from patrol, those typically come to us the next day. Our patrol folks will impound them out at the scenes. They go in a locker at the precinct, and then our property folks go clean those lockers out every morning. And those guns we receive those guns every afternoon. So it's typically the following day. It is a blanket, either it was on the person or it wasn't on the person. The gun was found on the person. We are using what we call our clean techniques, and we are gloves, masks, bleaching surfaces, clean butcher paper. We even, like the shoe covers that they use at crime scenes. We have a shoot tank. We're using those shoe covers over the port of our shoot tank so that we are not touching the guns to every single gun to the same surface. So each gun gets a new cover on the tank so that the end of the gun is not coming in contact with the tank. So we are, if the gun was recovered off of a person, we are simply using our clean techniques to proceed with test firing the firearm. We don't need to prove possession because it's already been shown through the body cam footage and the testimony of the officers. And then the gun goes back to property and we have our test fires for entering the NIBIN. The gun was found anyplace else, we're always going to implement those same swabbing techniques prior to test firing the gun. If, let's say the gun comes back and it's the gun that killed Kennedy, then it can still go to the lab for further processing. It can still go and have additional swabs done. It can still go and have prints done on the smooth surfaces. All of that can still be accomplished by our crime lab. They will always process our swabs first, since they already have them, they're already done. They already have those swabs available to them. If our swabs don't present them any good DNA or it's mixed samples, those sorts of things, they have the ability to go and do additional swabbing and printing on the firearm. Okay, this is kind of what it looks like. So top left shows one of our civilians swabbing the firearm. Again, gloves, lab coats, masks, clean surfaces, they're bleaching all their stuff in between. The swabs themselves go into the little envelopes you see at the bottom left-hand corner. We just place the swabs into that envelope. It gets labeled with all the information from the firearm, and then that envelope of swabs gets dropped right back into the same packaging that the firearm was in. We don't have to impound it separately. It will get documented in our report, our swabbing procedures. That is typically done in conjunction with our test fire report, all those sorts of things, but it is all documented, and then those swabs are dropped right back into the bag with the firearm. In partnership with our with our evidence processing unit, who actually does the prints and further DNA on all of the evidence, they asked us to include these little diagrams. This was just clip art that we printed online. But by having these little diagrams, that they're sticker labels we attach to our envelopes, now we can communicate with our lab personnel as to exactly the areas on each of the guns that we swabbed when we did our processing. That way there's no confusion. When they're looking at the firearm and they have our swabs, they know exactly what areas of the firearm we swabbed to collect our samples. Our crime lab, they are the ones who came up with the training for this. So they come and they have this sort of modified training specifically for our crime gun intelligence personnel and anybody that works with us that's going to be doing the swabbing process of the firearms, so they can go get DNA certified by our crime lab in this specific process. And it keeps everybody on the same page. So our crime lab knows exactly how we're doing it because they've trained us and certified us to do it. And we are communicating with them exactly how we're doing it and showing them the exact areas that we are processing. The partnership there is huge in order to be able to do it this way. Both my civilian staff and my sworn staff are trained in these swabbing techniques and in NIBIN entries. So my detectives are cross-trained. They're all cross-trained in how to do NIBIN. If they go out on a 2 or 3 a.m. call out in the middle of the night, they can bring the guns back, they can swab them, they can shoot them, they can do the NIBIN entry and have their answers that night. So they are all cross-trained on this. And then the top right corner shows you our shoot tank. You can see the little blue, we call them booties, the little blue shoe covers that are over the port on the tank. And then we always have 2 shooters. The person who's handling the firearm only touches the firearm. The second individual, who is the witness, only handles the actual packaging and the changing of supplies and those sorts of things. That way, again, we're incredibly cognizant of not contaminating these firearms, since we want them to be available for further prints and DNA. That is our promise to all of our case agents, is that we're going to swab when necessary to preserve, but we're always going to maintain our ability to get additional prints and DNA at a later point in time if it's necessary. And then again, training them when it's necessary versus when it's not necessary. We get a lot of questions here related to, okay, well then what's the difference between what your crime gun intelligence folks can do who are outside of the lab versus what our firearms detail inside the lab can do, specifically when it comes to court and testifying in court and the type of information that we're able to give. So anything that comes from our crime gun intelligence unit is preliminary. It is all presumptive, preliminary, nothing's confirmed. We are incredibly intentional in our wording of our supplements, in our reports that we're writing, that we do not ever indicate that something is a match. It is a potential preliminary, the preliminary evaluation would indicate a potential match. We don't want to put anything into writing that could later be contradicted by our crime lab. So everything that we do is preliminary, and it is intended to expedite the process, that we can give this information to our investigators and they can run forward on it as quickly as possible. And we're not tied up by the length of time it takes for a confirmation to occur. Our case agents are allowed to use our preliminary results in search warrants, so long as they have established probable cause in other areas. Our preliminary results are allowed to be used in conjunction with probable cause in order to be able to move forward. So they do it all the time. There is, and I can add this link later on, but Ultra Electronics has put out a book called Toolkit for Prosecutors. If you guys haven't seen it, it's available PDF online. We utilize that. It talks about terminology in affidavits. It talks about discovery, talks about a forensic firearms testimony versus a NIBIN text testimony. It talks about opinion versus scientific analysis. It covers a lot of questions for attorneys on what can and cannot be used and how to use it in a court process. I highly recommend it if you haven't already seen it. And again, Ultra Electronics puts it out, and it is the toolbook for prosecutors. So anyways, our crime gun intelligence unit we are not confirming that 2 casings are from the same gun, or that a casing came from a specific gun, just that the preliminary results would indicate a possible or probable match. Our lab folks have to confirm it. We can testify that a firearm functions. Here in Arizona, there are certain charges that require a firearm to be functional in order for those to hold up in court. We are not doing function tests on firearms. We are not scientists. We can't do function tests on firearms. However, when we are test firing firearms for the purpose of producing casings for entry into NIBIN, a byproduct of that is that the gun went bang, meaning it had to function in order for us to be able to do that. And as a result, we will often get called to court as civilians, as members of Crime Gun Intelligence Unit, to testify in court that the gun functioned. We can't tell you which direction the bullet twisted. We can't tell you the speed at which the bullet left. Can't do any of that. It's not a scientific analysis. It is just a fact that the gun functioned in order for us to be able to produce a casing for entry into NIBIN. And so we do get called to testify on that. I can tell you that in most cases, for our basic weapons investigations, that's all the court needs. And our detectives have not had to submit as many firearms to the crime lab for a full function test, because a full function test was not needed to prove functionality in court, because we had not even tested it, and us simply testifying that the gun was functional at the time of test fire filled that need for the prosecutors. We cannot testify as to why a gun does not fire. If a gun does not function, we simply say that we were unable to make that gun test fire by Crime Gun Intelligence Unit at the time that it was attempted. We cannot testify as to why. We don't know. We're not firearms examiners. Our lab personnel are the ones that need to be able to make that determination. So anytime we have a gun that comes through us that doesn't test fire, we will submit it to the crime lab, and if it's needed for court, then they can then go do a full function test on it, identify why the gun did or did not function, or make that firearm function, and then they will go testify to that process as a forensic firearms examiner in a court capacity. We do occasionally get called to testify on our swabbing techniques, especially if our swabs produce DNA off of a firearm that gets used later in court. So we obviously cannot testify as to the processing of that DNA, only to how we are actually collecting that DNA for that preservation. And then we can testify as to how we're testifying firearms. However, I don't think that has ever actually come up in court. Our lab services bureau that contains all of our sciences, our actual crime lab and our firearms detail, they can do those full-blown function tests for our detectives. They will do the direct comparisons on our casings, anything that is within the same incident, where they want guns and casings within the same incident to be compared to prove that this gun produced those casings. All of that is done by our forensic firearms examiners at the crime lab. They typically will say that that processing will occur if that's going to go and is needed for court. It is not automatic. we are not confirming all of our NIBIN leads here. We are only confirming NIBIN leads where that forensic firearms expert testimony is needed in court. In those instances, then our crime lab will process and do the direct comparisons and confirm all of those findings. If the person takes the plea and it's never needed, then those never get confirmed. Or if it's scheduled for trial and it gets processed, it will. So that is one of those. We are not confirming everything. We're only confirming the ones that are actually needed for court. And then, of course, our firearms examiners are doing our gun predicts. If we've got a bunch of casings at a scene and they are trying to figure out what kind of gun it potentially is, then they'll do the gun predicts. They obviously do way more than just these 3 bullet points on this slide. They have way more functionality than just this. But as it pertains to comparison with what we're doing, these were the important parts that we get asked about quite a bit here. Just to give you guys an example of some of the changes we saw in implementing this, in 2017, which is at the very beginning of our grant, we were averaging about 21% of our items getting processed, and it was averaging us about 125 days to get those items into the system. That evidence was producing us about 20 leads a month. We didn't have the written policy in place yet. We hadn't implemented any of these swabbing techniques, and we did not actually have a dedicated place to shoot. So those were all things that we had to address in the creation of our program. By November of 2021, we were processing all of our eligible evidence. We had most of it done within the 2 business days, but our average was sitting at about 1 day. We're not there right now. Our volume has gone up tremendously, so that average has gone up a little bit. But when we were at this point in time, we had hit our 2 business day goal, and it put us at about 190 leads a month. That has also gone up tremendously. We went from about 290 leads a month to over 2,000. We had just over 2,000 leads identified last year here in Phoenix for 2021. So that number has gone through the roof, which brings up more stuff that is always fun to try to address. But we do have that formal policy now in place. Additional things and ways that it impacted us. This was the initial impact it had on that average number of work days that it was taking us to get evidence into the system. You can see pre-grant, at the very beginning of the grant, you can see where we finally got our own designated place to shoot. We added some additional positions. We went from 1 civilian to 5 civilians, which we had to do because we were going from 20% of our evidence to 100% of our evidence. And then that new policy went into place in May of 2019, and we instantly had a huge impact on the average amount of time it was taking for us to get items of evidence into NIBIN. So the intended goal of making that change, we were able to achieve that. Again, the impact it had on our NIBIN leads was tremendous. Here in Phoenix, because we are outside of our crime lab, and because we are embedded within investigations, we have created a regional approach in which we have reached out to all of our surrounding agencies here in the state, and we've invited them to utilize our NIBIN site to do their evidence processing. Meaning, if they are willing to send 1 or 2 people to get certified in doing NIBIN entries, then they can come here to the Phoenix office and utilize our equipment to get their stuff into the system. So whether it's scene casings or test fires, they can bring them here and they can sit down at our systems and do their own entries into NIBIN here at our site. So when you talk about the number of leads, sometimes you'll see on here where it says other agency incidents. Obviously, a lot of our stuff crosses over to those other agencies, but the stats are all specific to just Phoenix. And then again, in 2021, we got over that 2,000 mark on our total number of leads. So part of our CGIC grant was partnering with Arizona State University as that third-party independent research component so that they could both assess the impact of our program, but also how we implemented it. So they looked at how we actually created our processes and how we implemented our processes, as well as the impact that these processes had on our clearance rates. And the most significant one that we had that, again, I talked about homicide being our biggest client, was that the results of this ASU study showed that when following implementation of CGIC, when we were involved, they saw a 36% increase in clearance rates for our homicide. It was tremendous. Our partnership with our homicide group has just been, it has been amazing. And so many of these cases overlap into these other areas. But this really helped us get the buy-in we needed to be able to push this thing out to everybody. And ASU has published this now. It is available. You can Google it. ASU's evaluation of the Phoenix CGIC has all the statistics of everything that they looked at. It is their official published research on this program and these processes. What worked, what didn't work, different recommendations, those sorts of things. But this was really one of the more significant findings that their research found. The other half of that is the effect it had on our evidence processing. We saw 115% increase in the volume of our evidence going in, 79% decrease in the amount of time it was taking us to do it, and 163% increase in the number of leads that we were able to identify as a result of making those changes. And then, not that you guys can link on it or click on it, but there is a link down there at the bottom for that published research. My advice to everybody that is looking to implement something of this nature within your own agencies, we get asked these questions a lot, is obviously you have to have a strategy for sustainability. A lot of the bosses don't like it when I say this, but it really helps to build these types of programs from the bottom up. And I say that because the impact that us making these changes had on all the different groups we worked with was tremendous. It impacted our property techs and how they were moving evidence through the warehouse. It impacted our crime scene, photo specialists, and us asking them to take photos of the guns and the casings first at the crime scene so that we could get those items earlier in the processing of that scene. We worked with them so that when they got to the scene, they would process the guns and casings first, take all those photos so that we could receive them, and then they could continue the rest of their scene investigation. We knew that was going to impact their process. We knew it was going to impact our patrol officers and whether they were going to be using our Dropbox here for casings. It was going to impact our detectives and what types of lab requests they were going to be sending. And so in order for this to be successful and sustainable, it was important for us to invite those individuals into the conversation, involve those doers, involve those people in the fine details, because you're going to impact the processes in which they're doing, and you will save yourself so much time and effort if you involve them at the beginning and ask them, how is this going to impact you and what can we do to make the impact less? You get more buy-in from them, then now they are excited about it, they agree with it, and your ability to be successful in implementing something that is this drastic of a change, your ability to be successful will almost definitely go up. So bring those doers in. If you bring in all of the bosses to make all the decisions, then those impacts you can't even see those negative impacts coming until it's already too late and you have to go in and redo things and change things and everything else. So bring those people in at the very beginning of these processes. Obviously, you have to have written policy to back everything that you do. Have a succession plan. You can't have one expert who knows everything. You have to have multiple people in there who understand not just the way things are being done, but why things are being done the way they're being done. So you have to have that succession plan in place. Let's see. So we like to throw this in here at the end. The implementation of all of these changes we've discussed today focus incredibly heavily on bolstering our evidence processing, that comprehensive evidence collection, and the 2-day NIBIN processing, that real-time NIBIN processing. It also focused heavily on us building that prosecution model that allowed us to group all of those incidents that were linked through NIBIN together so that we could charge them together to get those individuals held and not back out on bond. What it didn't do was offer us very much support in the actual ability to investigate these. And like I mentioned earlier, we went from about 290 leads to over 2,000 leads, and we had the same number of detectives. So for us, while it was incredibly successful, it brought on a new challenge of us now identifying a better way for us to handle our NIBIN investigations so that we weren't overwhelming our investigators with these NIBIN leads. And so we went back to the drawing table and came up with different strategies of how we can make our investigations more efficient. And as a result, we applied for the Strategies in Policing Innovations grant in 2020. We received that, and we have created what we call our Crime Gun Liaison program, which is we went to our detectives and we asked them, what can we do to help you? We're drowning you guys in NIBIN leads. What can we do to help you? And one of the biggest things they said was the quality of initial reports coming from the field. They were seeing a decline in the quality of initial reports coming from the field as our patrol folks were getting more and more less in numbers and responding to more and more calls. So how can we build a better bridge between us and patrol? Not to mention your patrol folks, they're the ones who are going to know what guy is driving through what neighborhood, shooting off guns at which houses. They're going to recognize the cars from any, video footage. They're going to know the players in their neighborhoods. They are a huge untapped resource for investigators, and they don't get utilized enough in being able to provide that information and intelligence in investigations because they get so focused on responding to calls and writing reports and just going to call after call after call. So we really wanted to build a bridge between us and our investigators, or between our investigators and patrol. So we created a Crime Gun Liaison program where we brought in 36 of our patrol folks from all different shifts over the department, and we put them through a 40-hour training of specifically how to investigate gun crime and taking photos, what kind of questions to ask, locking people into stories. We put them through the same swab training so they can swab in the field. But that had a tremendous impact on our investigators' ability to quickly tie these gun cases up. We also implemented some layering of technologies to help us with surveillances and being able to identify individuals, LPRs, license plate readers, those sorts of things. That is it for me for today. I know there's going to be questions, and I think Erin has been kind of tracking some of the questions as we go. This is my information up here, my email address for anybody. I can send you guys copies of policies or anything that you guys are interested in. I have copies of them. So feel free to reach out if you guys have additional questions after this finishes today. But Erin, I'm going to turn this over to you. I know you said you were going to be looking at some questions.
I have received so many great questions, Jessica. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I can always tell when an audience is engaged just based on the rapidity of the questions coming in, and a lot of that engagement, in fact, most of it has to do with our presenters. So great job. Folks, we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. I anticipate we're not going to be able to get through them all. So feel free to reach out to Jessica. You can see her email in front of you if we don't get to your question, or if you think of an additional question that we didn't respond to. Last thing before we get to questions, wanted to invite you all to join us on September 8th when we have a webinar on advocacy for firearm awareness and risk, improving the victim advocate response. If it sounds like something you'd be interested in, go to the Justice Clearinghouse website. From the webinar schedule indicator on the menu, select the webinar on September 8th, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Okay, Jessica, if you're ready, let's start going through these questions.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I knew one of these questions would end up coming up during the webinar, and it was our very first one from Michael. Have privately made firearms impacted your ability to link suspects across multiple shootings?
We really have not gotten very many, to be honest. We just got asked this question recently, and for all of 2021 and year-to-date 2022, we've only received 90 of the ghost guns or the poly 80s. And when you're talking about 450 guns a month, that number is incredibly small. So my answer to you right now is no. We're not having a problem with it just because there isn't the volume there for that to be significant here in Phoenix. I don't know if other agencies are seeing more of those come through, but here in Phoenix, we're not seeing them. They're not an issue for us as of yet.
Got it. Yep, I know that one of the things that we heard in a different webinar is those privately made firearms are more common in jurisdictions, states where there are more restrictive firearms laws. California being one example that I was told.
Yeah,
okay.
And we don't have that.
Right. Yep. Nope.
Have those.
I'm very familiar with Arizona gun laws, and I agree. Okay, next most popular question is Eric and Cameron would like to know, do you have a product link or can you provide information about where you're purchasing the plastic snap top cartridge cases from?
I get asked that question all the time. Yes. I'm not promoting any vendors or anything like that. You whatever vendors you want, but I will gladly, I don't have it off the top of my head. So if they'll email me that so that I can respond to them, I have to look it up where we're getting them from. But yes, I have all the information on the files.
Perfect. So Eric and Cameron and anyone else interested in those plastic snap top cartridge cases, feel free to reach out to Jessica Ellifritz at phoenix.gov. Okay, Eric also wanted to know more about the vials. How are they packaged further? Is that an individual label on the vial, or do they go into an envelope that he apparently saw in the background of one of the photos?
So all of our stuff is packaged in the bags. So they're big, clear plastic bags, and we have encouraged whoever's processing the scene to take all of the casings from that scene and try to put them all into the one bag so that we get everything in its totality. It's just easier for us when we're doing our pre-screening that way. So they will number all of those vials and then put all of them together, and then you can go back and reference the number of the vial to the location and different parts in their reports. But when we go through and we do our pre-screening, whichever one we are identifying for entry into the system, we are putting a fluorescent pink. I don't know why we use fluorescent pink, but all of our NIBIN stuff is fluorescent pink. We use these fluorescent pink stickers, and it says processed by NIBIN, and it's got a date and our serial number, and we stick it to that casing to show that that's the casing that was entered into the system. We have an identical one if we're swabbing that casing that says we've swabbed that casing. So the stickers actually get placed on the vials, and then everything gets put back into the evidence bag and resealed when we're done. We have on occasion, if we have, say, 3 or 4 different guns in there, we might, when we're doing our sorting and identifying the different guns, use it like a secondary Ziploc bag to group them. Like, okay, all these came from one gun, and here's the one that was entered from that gun. All of these came from one gun, here's the one that was entered from that gun. And then put those bags back into the larger bag, just to make it easier on our crime lab. But again, our stuff is just preliminary. So when we do that grouping, we're very careful to make sure they understand that that's just a preliminary grouping, and that the lab needs to confirm that sort of thing. So it all just goes into one giant bag, and we're using those stickers to identify the individual items being entered into the system.
Great, thank you so much. Richard was wondering, which data sources are you leveraging, local or national?
Oh, data sources. I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. I know that, did you have more for me, Aaron?
Yeah, I was just going to say it came in with a bunch of other questions about NIBIN, so perhaps NIBIN data sources. That's just a guess, though.
Well, I'm going to guess, but we're utilizing NESS. So we have access to NESS or ATF for all of our NIBIN lead info, although we're not using it to the full extent of its capacity, only because we don't have an interface with it right now. So our information is getting hand typed in there by our wonderful ATF contractors, because we're in the middle of our records management system conversion. So we don't have a direct feed into NESS yet. I have some customized reports I've gotten from FTI in the past that I use for a lot of our statistics. My site is a little bit different because I have 22 agencies doing their entries here. So I have more than just Phoenix PD doing entries on my site. So I have to split out the Phoenix data from the other agencies to get an accurate assessment of average time to crime, those sorts of things. So I will get that direct report from FTI most of the time. We use, as far as technology goes, just to kind of broaden that up a little bit, we're using nighthawk.cloud for a lot of our social media mapping. We are doing a lot of geofence warrants. So like all of our, let's say you have 5 incidents and you've linked them all through NIBIN, and 3 of them are shots fired calls with no suspects, no witnesses, nobody cares, they're just casings in the street. But these 2 are ag assaults, with the last one being a shooting, and we link to all these shots fired calls and we don't have a suspect. We can do a geofence warrant. If we have those links in real time, we can do geofence warrants around all 5 locations to identify, you know, a cell phone that was present at all 5 incidents. And now we've turned those shots fired calls with no information into gold for us, because we have that tower data available to identify an individual who was at all 5, or a cell phone that was in the vicinity of all 5 instances. So if you're talking about that sort of stuff, we're utilizing that sort of data in being able to leverage NIBIN in the investigative world as a tool, and turning those shots fired calls into usable information and intelligence.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's great. Okay, next question is from Marcus. Marcus says, we have had some discussion on finding viable fingerprints or DNA on fired casings. Are you aware of any cases where your agency has found them?
So not fingerprints, but DNA, yes. And I hate to admit that out loud, because we would have loved to have gone away from swabbing the casings, because your ability to get DNA on them is so small. However, 2 instances since I've started this in 2010, we have gotten DNA off of casings. One of them happened to be one of our sheriff's deputies that was killed in the driveway of his home with a .22. And the DNA off that casing led to the arrest of the suspect. And the second one was that forensic psychologist Stephen Pitt, when he was killed out here in Arizona. One of the casings from his scene had viable DNA that we were able to use for the familial DNA for the match to the suspect's son. So being that those were such high-profile cases, our agency will never go away from swabbing casings. But we were able to mitigate the volume of which we're swabbing by using those vials and only only processing it if it's actually needed for trial.
Got it. Great. Brittany was wondering, is the policy that you helped develop something that you might be willing to share with other agencies to take a look at for ideas?
Yeah, Brittany, email me and I'll send you a copy of it.
Well, that was easy. Thank you so much. All right.
We've given you that a bunch of times. Yes, no, absolutely.
Jeff would like to know, how do you handle potentially unsafe firearms without performing a function check? Have you had any safety issues?
We don't. If we see something that we're even slightly concerned about being unsafe, we will take it over to our crime lab and they can do it. Sometimes, because we have that relationship with them, we can call them up and say, hey, we have one that we want to test fire, but we're kind of iffy about it. We can walk it, our crime lab is directly across the street. We can walk it across the street to their actual range, and they will simply stand by us while we will perform the test fire at the actual range instead of using the shoot tank, if that's something that's going to make it safer. But we have very strict rules for how we are test firing the guns. We have a sand trap in there with our tank so that they could potentially do a function test on it over the sand trap if they needed to, make sure that it's functioning, or if there's something stuck in it or something like that. And then, down range, when you're shooting to a shoot tank, is about this big around. And so you don't load a bullet into that gun unless the muzzle is in that port, and you don't close the slide on that gun unless the muzzle is in that port. Because if you get a slam fire or a hang fire or something like that, it needs to be contained at the point that that occurs. And so we have really strict rules in our shoot room when it comes to shooting. Anything that looks like it's got loose parts or those sorts of things, we won't mess with. It can go to the lab can do it.
Fantastic. Okay, next question is from Eric. He is wondering if you have any tips for test firing guns that have biohazards like like blood on them.
Oh, we see this mostly with the suicides. We'll get the guns in from suicides that are covered in bio. And what we have gotten in the habit of doing is, if it's a suicide, there's probably a scene casing. And if homicide isn't concerned and they believe it's a suicide and there's nothing to indicate that it's not a suicide, then because again, we're not firearms examiners, so everything we do is presumptive anyways, we will process the scene casing and not the firearm. So we'll enter in the scene casing, but not the firearm, because it's already presumptive that that gun produced that casing. And then if the detective wants further processing done on the gun, it can go to the lab for that. That's kind of how we have proceeded with it. The only time that it gets a little gray is if there's 3 or 4 guns at the scene, those sorts of things. But typically, most of our bio guns are from the suicides. Occasionally, we'll get one from a homicide. There have been times where we have taken a clean evidence bag and put it over the firearm at the time that we test fire it to contain anything that might, blow back or those sorts of things. But we try to avoid that when we can.
Awesome. Okay. I did want to share a comment from one of our attendees, Jennifer, who said that new techniques in DNA recovery are very successful with a 20% plus recovery rate of usable DNA. And she references a San Diego Police Department white paper, it sounds like. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, Jessica, or?
I am not, but I'm sure our crime lab folks are.
Got it. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think we have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. Richard would like to know, can you talk a little bit about how you are building link charts?
So we're for the most part using I2, which I'm sure a lot of people are utilizing. This is a trick question. So one of the mechanisms in which we are tracking our NIBIN leads is within our records management system, you have incidents that occur, and then you create a case management for that incident. Well, you can create more than one case management for an incident. So what we did is we got with our tech folks and had them create some additional fields for us. When we identify a NIBIN lead, we create a new case management with a case type of NIBIN lead. And within that case management, we can link all of our incidents together. And then that case management can get assigned to one of our CGIC detectives, separate from the case management that's assigned to whoever the investigator is on that incident. And then our CGIC detective can manage all of the linked incidents and work in conjunction with our detectives on the individual incidents. We created it's just a macro in Excel where we can download all of those NIBIN leads with all those associated incidents, and therefore the people within those incidents and vehicles within those incidents into an Excel spreadsheet that we can then import into I2 to help with the mapping. That helped big time. However, if you guys are utilizing NES has the ability to do that as well. And it will pull it, and you can designate up to, I think, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever they call it. I think you can go in there and tell NES, I want to export out up to 6 levels of connection to a specific NIBIN lead or a specific incident. And then in that same concept, you could build a template in I2 to absorb that spreadsheet and produce your link chart. Our analysts here is through our ATF partnership, and he does most of our link charts for us by pulling it through NES. Any of the ones we're doing internally, we're utilizing our records management system to pull it into I2. I hope that answered your question and didn't make it more complicated.
Perfect. Jessica, thank you so much. You just provided such an incredible wealth of information for our audience today. Folks, again, if I didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out to Jessica. Likewise, if you want to get access to that policy, more details about those snap files, reach out to Jessica. It's jessica.ellifritz@phoenix.gov. And if you end up discovering that you can't read your writing or can't find her email address after the webinar ends, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'm happy to share whatever message you'd like with Jessica. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time, but before we go, Jessica, any closing comments you'd like to make?
No, thank you guys all for participating and getting on here and listening to me talk at you for an hour. Appreciate it. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you guys have questions. Like I said, I can send any information you guys want. We get a lot of people asking us for it. So I probably have it if you want to ask me for it. So but thanks you guys very much for your time.
Thank you. And as always, thank you to our audience for taking the time to join us today. And with that, this concludes this afternoon's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful long weekend, and please stay safe. Bye now.